My name is Sandy Maxon. It's my honor to be here to represent the Victoria Festival of Authors Board of Directors and welcome you to tonight's event, Epics and Echoes, featuring authors Tsering Yengsom Lama, Shalene Knight, J.M. Miro, and Danny Ramadan, with music from Jen Severtson. J.M. Miro is slightly delayed, going to be joining after the intermission. I want to start tonight by acknowledging that the Victoria Festival of Authors and Metro Theatre are located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Lekwungen-speaking people, known also as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. Whether you're participating in this event here in person tonight or virtually from other territories, we acknowledge the ancestors, the hereditary leaders and matriarchs, as well as the creators from these lands, and we're committed to serving as learners and listeners. I'd like you to join me in thanking our sponsors, the BC Arts Council, the Canada Council of the Arts, the CRD, the City of Victoria, Access Copyright, the Victoria Foundation, and Munro's Books. And a special thank you to the Writers' Union of Canada, who sponsored Danny's appearance in the festival. Thanks to Moe's Home Collection and Poppy's Floral for our lovely staging. I also want to let you know that there is a 15-minute intermission midway through the event. If you need to visit the bathroom, you'll find it back through the lobby and up the stairs. If you're in need of closed captioning, it is being provided and can be accessed through your phone or tablet. Please ask a volunteer for the Wi-Fi password and the URL if you want to access closed captioning. At the end of the event, the books will be available for purchase and signing at the lovely Munro's table. You can visit Ali there. This panel is hosted by Jen Severtson. Jen is a singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist based in Victoria. She has been actively touring and recording with bands for over 15 years and has released or featured on 14 studio albums, with 8 different artists and collectors, including her current moniker, Peach Pyramid. Please welcome Jen.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. This first song that I'm going to play is called Bright Blue.
Bright blue, you're telling me I have no clue. Well, I can't stand to be alone, but maybe I should just go home. I walk, make it halfway down your block. As the buildings fade, I replay our talk. Tongue-tied, couldn't tell you if I tried. Would you want me to tell you maybe some other time? I'll have another as you roll your eyes underwater. The surface sure looks nice. So sweet, I feel the sting on my cheek. Where you pressed your lips forgot to breathe. Calm down. I had to tell myself not to jump ahead, so I plant myself now. I'll have another as you roll your eyes underwater. The surface sure looks nice. I'll have another as you roll your eyes underwater. The surface sure looks nice. Surface sure looks nice. Surface sure looks nice.
Thank you. I'm going to look to my notes so that I don't forget what I'm saying. But I'm very excited that everybody could be here tonight, and it is my pleasure to welcome these authors to the stage that'll be reading for you today. So first off, Vancouver-born Shalene Knight is the author of Braided Skin and Dear Current Occupant. Winner of the Vancouver Book Award, Shalene is the founder of Breathing Space Creative, through which she launched the Forever Writers Club. Shalene works as a literary agent at Transatlantic Agency, and she currently lives at Harrison Hot Springs, BC. Please join me in welcoming Shalene Knight.
All right, so wonderful to be here. I'm really excited to read for all of you today, and I just want to say thank you to Jen. That song was beautiful, and even the title, Bright Blue. It gets me thinking about my main character, Junie, who tries to figure out who she is as a young black female in this area of Vancouver called Hogan's Alley. And as she's kind of rebuilding this identity, she asks herself over and over again, what is the color of love? What is the color of this relationship with my mother? What is the color of this struggle that I'm going through? So I think that was rather appropriate to have that song. So I'm gonna read a few vignettes to start. And my book is interesting in that it has a chronological narrative, but it is spliced with these first-person vignettes. And so anytime I'm reading a vignette, maybe I'll just put my finger up so you know that I'm shifting from the main narrative into the first-person vignettes. So these first three vignettes kind of cover my main character, Junie, with her mother. So we kind of feel the tension between the two. This is a relationship of love, but a very complex and different kind of relationship. And then from that, we shift and we see my character, Junie, with her partner, Lou, and we see how different these two relationships really are. I sit across from my mother, my arms folded gingerly in my lap. We sit together but apart at our small kitchen table, eating each other's silence around a plate of toast and 2 half-full glasses of powdered milk, the edges crusted with white. A sliver of sunlight shoulders its way into the room through the sheer curtains that hang above the large double sink. The cadenced sound of the slow dripping water from the faucet pools in a greasy salad bowl. I listen as the water rises. How can so many droplets fill the dips and valleys like that? How long does it take for each tiny drop of water to build a community in a small bowl? I focus on the sound. It hammers through my ears in time with the thunderous pressure in my chest. I search the table for the buried jam that has disappeared just as quickly as Mama's wages. Mama's eyes clutch mine and then release. The split second of guilt in her gaze is quickly replaced with indifference. Eat your toast, little girl. Mama wraps her lips around a cigarette, then exhales a fog of smoke that hovers above the bread like a rain cloud. I help cinch a thin tea rose stretchy garment with 1,000 mini eye hooks around Mama's broad waist and the lower half of her body. A lit cigarette flaps between her lips as she grunts, pries, stretches, and pleads with the fabric. The veins in her neck stand guard. Come on, Junie, now pull the other end. Mama stands in front of her vanity, the room dismal. Me, on my knees. I fasten the first 3 eye hooks as Mama takes another inhalation, and then quickly secure the other teeth-like hooks in between. I feel hot ash land on my head. I brush it away without a word and stand up. I step back and look at Mama. It's eating her. The skin around her waist is pulled in so tightly, but I can't stop my imagination from spinning. I picture the flesh folding over itself like an unplayed accordion, a squeeze box. I see all the air in Mama's body vibrating, flying up into her throat and back down to her toes, her torso a concave hollow shell. Why would anyone want to suck the sound out of themselves like this? Mama's storytelling takes hold after she's had a few fingers of gin. Now I know the signs. Mama's eyes lower down on those who don't live like she lives, who don't spend all their dollars buying the first or the best fruit spreads, tinned salmon, and lard for skillet frying their chicken. Mama wants to have what others don't have, just so she can say she has it. The world needs to pay attention to Mama and give her all the money she deserves because she is a star after all. This is what she tells me, and I don't know how to swallow her words down. They scrape the insides of my throat as they go. Mama turns her nose up at anyone who doesn't worship her or at least agree with her. She talks about the men who spoon themselves around her body most evenings when she steps off that stage. She tells me how their strong arms keep her warm at night. But when the golden halo of the morning tiptoes in through the curtains, she sends them running home. She tells me how she tosses their worn shoes at them in disgust. Everyone wants a piece of Maddie Lancaster, she says. The more the stories fly from Mama's mouth, the more I retreat into myself, just like the folded accordion skin held back by 1,000 teeth-like eye hooks. At breakfast, I see 2 nickels on the table to erase the stories she can't remember telling. I'll read a few more pages. So now I want to kind of dive into Junie's relationship with her partner, Lou, just so we can kind of see how different that is and how differently she sees the world. I fall unplumbed into Lou's emerald eyes and listen as she speaks of her own history, her mother's chicken pot pie, her daddy's chestnut brown leather wingback chair, and the last breath her mother took while cradled in her arms. I don't blink when she tells me about the consistent act of burying her dead, how it was so frequent that eventually she couldn't help but become numb to the loss. Lou tells me about her younger brother who lives in Ontario and writes romance novels. She tells me how their first family pet, a dog named Beans, was struck by a train when she was 12. I sweep my thumb across her cheeks as she tells me how her own mother's laugh filled a room on Saturday nights when she'd gather the family and tell stories of one of her books in progress. She tells me that her mother dreamed of being a writer and that she played with language the way I play with color. We stop and breathe together. I learned so much about her own love of art through her telling of these close relationships with her family. She tells me that the memories are the best part of her, the parts no one can ever take away. She says these memories change and melt over time, so she falls into them as often as she can. Lou folds herself into me, her body a convulsing piece of paradise I never want to lose. Junie sat in a back pew of the church, fanning her face. Maddie was nowhere to be seen. The two women sitting directly in front of Junie spun their heads around on occasion, with no attempt to muffle their gossipy whispers. Yes, I mean, from what I hear from her mother, she doesn't even like men. She's one of those sinners. God help her. Someone ought to save her. Well, the other woman said as she turned back slowly to look at Junie, at least she's in the right place. Amen. These women didn't even know her, nor had they ever made any attempt at real conversation. They believed what they wanted to believe. Junie hadn't been going to church regularly, but today she felt compelled to be present for herself. The more poetry she read, the closer she came to understanding her own feelings and all that God talk she had to hear from her mother. Looking around at everyone in the room with their heads down, all their heartaches and mistakes motionless in their chests. Maybe Junie did want to be saved like everyone else. Maybe she wanted to feel something, anything. Maybe she was waiting for Jesus to swoop down and infuse some kind of cleansing power into her, make her free, save her. In her head, Junie revisited those Sundays with her mother, arriving at church late as Maddie pulled her by the wrist, causing a commotion as she flung the doors of the church open, all eyes on them. Maddie, eyes red-rimmed from an all-nighter, and Junie, her innermost desires glued to the outside of her skin for all to see. Sinners. Now the whispers in front of her became thunderous. The flower pattern on her dress spun around her knees. She leaned her head back, and a trickle of sweat crawled the maze of her ear. The organ playing became more clamorous, and the singing and shouting and spiraling in Junie's head became too intense. She clasped her hands over her ears and shut her eyes. When all was finally quiet, no bright light came. She was not saved. It's night, but no darkness comes. I sit on a small stool for hours and watch the sun rise. I pull the canvas in close, draw an outline of myself. I contort my body and hug my knees into my ribs and wait. I count my sins. Thank you. Okay. It had been 52 days since Junie held her mother's heaving body. The days pooled like the murky water at the bottom of her sink. Junie sat in her kitchen trying to make sense of her mother's absence. Why hadn't her mother called? Why hadn't she shown up to work? She hadn't knocked on the door, standing there with one of her signature Maddie looks plastered across her face. I'm sure she's fine. But Junie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong or about to be wrong. The flowered walls seemed to dance around her. She couldn't push down the worry or the lump in her throat. For the first time, Junie was happy. She was living her life, doing her art, but she was still worried about Maddie. With the tip of her long, brown index finger, she pushed a paperclip around on the fake marble table, her other hand planted firmly under her chin. She was in full-blown thinking mode, and full-blown thinking mode always led to the past. Memory was a funny thing. Sometimes all it took was a glimpse of a half-full bottle of lager, the shiny glint of a microphone, or a blues song playing on the low in the sitting room. Sad and deep tones wafting up the stairs to her room to transport Junie right back to the hazy times of her childhood. There she was, 13 again, with her oversized, faded dresses, constantly mesmerized by her best friend Estelle's thin fingers slowly wrapping around her curls that camped out around her face. And then there was her mama, slung over the couch, blouse open, and 5 red lipstick-painted bottles hanging out on the sitting room coffee table. Junie sat there in her small kitchen and wiped away the sudden wetness that found itself on the curve of her cheeks. Her kitchen was her safe place. Although small, it was hers. It was light and airy. Her kettle and her newly found love for tea kept her insides warm, no matter what coldness surrounded her. She sat there with her plate of toast and 3 different types of jam, and there was no steady dripping from the faucet. She closed her eyes and breathed in so colossally, she pictured the rise of her chest as her lungs filled to capacity, and then shrunk with her slow, closed-eye exhale. Junie knew that Maddie had dreams. She had wanted to be a star. She had the silkiest pipes this side of town. She had dreamed of albums, tours, and the radio blasting her voice. But the drink spoke louder. Thinking back to all the drunken nights Junie had found her mother slumped over somewhere in their small home, thinking back to all the arguments and the horrid slurs that spewed from her once so beautiful mother's mouth, made her heart ache. She had never seen her mother cry and let go the way she did in the diner that day. The way she heaved into Junie's arms and the warmth of her large body, a blanket that Junie had wanted to pull around her all her life. I hug my mother for as long as I can. I feel her flesh boil. I think back to one of my first days in the school cafeteria and the cheese sandwich. I see that bird again, her shimmery blue and green feathers plucked into a pile on my plate. At this moment, I can finally release her, let her go. This is how I can exist inside of my own living, and that it's okay that there is no color for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalene. That was awesome. Okay. Seiring Yangzom Lama holds a BA in Creative Writing and International Relations from the University of British Columbia and an MFA from Columbia University. Born and raised in Nepal, Seiring has lived in Toronto, New York City, and Vancouver, where she now resides. We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies is her first novel, and please join me in welcoming Seiring.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you to Victoria Writers Fest for having me. This is my first time being part of this festival, and it's really nice to be in Victoria. And actually, I visited the bookstore nearby too, and that was a really beautiful bookstore. So I feel fortunate to be here, and thank you all for being here as well. I'm just going to read the first 6 pages of my novel. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. So this is at the border of Western Tibet and Nepal, spring 1960. Amma was an oracle. The realization came to my mother late in life, when her monthly bleeding stopped and something else opened inside. Some in our village called it an affliction. They said there was a crack in her mind, which left her open to spirits who would consume her. But Amma insisted it was a blessing to be able to lend her body to the gods and let them speak through her. In time, everyone would listen, and the words of an otherwise ordinary woman would lead us through the coming troubles. It wasn't just my mother who had changed. Packs of wolves and rats swept through our valley. Next, there was an earthquake that tore a jagged line through our village monastery. Then, just as I was learning to speak, there came news that invaders had crossed our eastern border entering our land as two enormous snakes. In the distant town of Kardze, people watched them cross the river in long lines and burrow into the highlands. They wished to be called the People's Liberation Army, but we knew them as the Kyami, a people from the lowlands to the east. In the years that followed, rumors came like crows, even traveling as far west as our village. Although I was just a young girl, many of the rumors landed at my ears before anyone else in my family. My source was Laksam, my oldest friend. He worked as a servant to a traveling merchant who traded in gossip as much as iron pots and pans. In our free moments, Laksam and I wandered in the pastures with my little sister Tenki, hanging on my back or flopping around in the grass. In those hills, Laksam told me the most shocking stories. Kyami soldiers had seized farmland in the east, and most of our people were now starving. No grain, no salt, no meat, or even butter. I walked around in a daze after hearing this, unable to imagine life without butter. Laksam said that although it was quiet in our region, a resistance raged in the east, in places where iron birds circled the skies and bullets, big and small, rained down on entire towns, smashing bodies as if they were nothing but effigies made of dough. Where rooftops were torn apart and no one could tell whether they had found the remains of a loved one or that of a stranger. But I did not tell my family these things. I never repeated them to anyone. Then, last spring, our village heard of a terrifying ruse, a plan to lead the precious one into the dragon's home. Hearing about this trap, thousands of our people gathered in Lhasa, outside the summer palace, forming a protective circle with their bodies. Even as the soldiers neared and the scent of gunpowder swirled in the air, our people refused to leave. To prevent a massacre, the precious one disguised himself as a commoner and fled south by night to another country. So did the great Nechung Oracle, who had divined their escape route through the mountains. When the foreign troops learned that our leader had slipped away, they pierced the crowd with bullets and lined the street with corpses. After the precious one left, the sun was erased from our skies. Flowers refused to bloom, and our yaks made no milk. In that darkness, every family in our village wondered if it was time to leave, to follow our leader to the lowlands until the day when it would be safe to return. Others recited a bleak ancient prophecy. When the iron bird flies and horses run on wheels, the people of snows will be scattered like ants across the face of the earth. It was that day, nearly 10 years after revealing that the gods had spoken to her, when Amma said to us, "Now is the time. I must give my body to the spirits." Sitting on the kitchen floor beside my sister, I watched my father's face in the hearth's glow. Bala remained still as we chewed on strips of dried meat that Amma had cured over the winter. I could see that our father was clearly picturing everything that would change for us. But after a long while, he frowned, showing all his new wrinkles at once, and nodded in agreement. By morning, our entire village had heard that Amma would begin the rites for instructing the gods. She would finally call them down to her. It made sense when they said Tenki was too young to watch the initiation. She was barely 10. But I couldn't believe it when Pala also ushered me out of the room. While at least 20 people from our village filed into the kitchen, many of them patting Tenki and me on our cheeks and heads as if to cheer us up, the two of us were forced to wait in the hallway. Even Laksam managed to slip in, though not without flashing a huge grin in my direction. I stood there chewing my nails until the prayers began. Then I realized what I needed to do. Taking Tenki outside, I ordered my sister to gather our sheep along the hills and bring them all back, a task that would take at least an hour, even with our dog Dixon's help. Thankfully, my sister was somewhat obedient this time. She went off to search for the sheep, and I rushed back home to watch the ceremony through a slit in the wooden door. Over a thick huddle of bodies, I saw Amma seated on the ground with her head down. Beside her stood a teacher monk and his young assistant, who looked frightened to perform a task like this when he typically spent his days carrying milk and water up to the monastery. "If you are a god," said the elderly monk as he faced my mother, "take this apron." The assistant produced an apron and tied it around my mother's waist. Amma continued to gaze at the floor as her body trembled. "If you are a god, Then take this drum and bell. The assistant placed these instruments in Amma's hands. Come to this woman, speak to us. Stay not at the mountaintop, but come to us. Amma began to shake and whisper in a bird-like voice. The assistant placed a heavy embroidered cape around her shoulders, then a 5-pointed crown on her head. Despite the weight of the regalia, Amma hopped up on her feet and began to rock side to side. The assistant moved away, his eyes wide with fear, but the teacher monk called him back. Take this golden drink, he said, holding out a bowl of beer. Putting down her instruments, my mother took the bowl, offered it to the sky, and drank the beer in one gulp like a man. Then she danced, spinning to the left and right, dipping and jerking her head. The teacher monk leaned in, pushed my mother's shoulders down to keep her still, and spoke into her ear. She shook like a startled horse and uttered a language I could not understand. Was this the language of the gods? Hearing my mother's words, the teacher monk nodded and reached into a bowl of rice. With a graceful flick, he tossed a handful of grains onto the drum held flat in his hand. It sounded like a rain shower and still echoes in my head. It is dangerous to call the gods, he told the audience. We must ensure that we have not called a malicious spirit by mistake. The teacher monk explained that if an evil spirit entered her body, there would be chaos for Amma and everyone who sought her help. On the other hand, if part of my mother's consciousness remained in her body when the spirit entered, she would become half god and half human, and then we could not trust her words. Hearing this, I began to shake. If the gods never left my mother's body, she would never be herself again. Why would Pala agree to this? Yet it was already far too late to stop. The teacher said that it was time for the test. Amma must be able to say, without looking, exactly how many grains of rice had landed on the drum. She also needed to know the meaning of this number, what it prophesied. Pressing my face into the door, I strained to learn the outcome. I had my answer when the elderly monk slowly knelt and prostrated himself before my mother. A wave of prayers rose from the crowd as they too lowered to the floor. Only I remained standing, peering through the crack, trying in vain to catch a glimpse of my mother's face. Then my chest felt heavy like wet clay, and I was drawn face down to the floor. My palms pressed above my head, my lips moving rapidly in prayer as breath spread between my ribs. Word traveled across the Western Plains. Visitors came to see my mother, a little wary and curious, bowing and speaking in hushed tones like they did at the monastery. Even my father's old friend Chosang arrived at our door with his ailing son between his legs. Everything has changed, Bala said, but to me she's still just my Yangchen. Yes, that must also be true, Chosang replied, tidying his worn sleeves as he settled in and waited for his son's turn with Amma. In the days that followed, Bala fetched 2 servants to help with the visitors. Tenki and I watched them float around the house with tea and food and ceremonial objects for divinations, while parched, weary horses milled about the courtyard and waited for their masters to be healed. How many hundreds came in that strange time, in the year before we fled the highlands? How many came knocking on our wooden door, sweeping in the dust with their foreign robes, leaving their scent long into the evening? Even now, so far from home, I can close my eyes and remember this peculiar silk brocade designs on the sleeves and collars. I can picture the red gown worn by a distant warlord's wife, that thin, white-haired woman who had asked if her child's marriage was well fated. She said her own marriage had been an unhappy one, and whatever answer Amma gave, the woman returned again to ask if she should make a pilgrimage to Lhasa despite ill health and invading forces. Just as Tenki and I had grown used to her visits, a summer and a fall passed without any sight of her. There came rumors that she had fallen down a well or was called to its bottom by an evil spirit. Now it seems more likely that the Gyami had imprisoned her. Then there were the visitors who came to ask about the health of their herds and whether they should search at home or in the hills for a lost turquoise. Some came with ailments like melancholy and restlessness. They said only Amma could name the source of their sorrows. Only she could banish the evil from their bodies. Yes, that is what they said. It wasn't long after Amma's initiation that the snake entered our village. A row of dark trucks, rattling the earth and sending up clouds of dust. Still, the foreigners didn't seem as frightening as I had imagined. I had almost expected to see horns sticking out of their heads. But they were just young men and women who insisted they had come not to hurt us. All they wanted to do was gather everyone and have a conversation. We were required to do as they said, so Tanky and I walked to the village square as Dixon followed closely by. The crowd was thick, but we slipped in to the first row. "We have heard about the oracles in your region," said the head soldier, his country's words translated by a former salt merchant who was now working for the invaders. "It's time to get to the bottom of these rumors," the merchant translated, though his Lhasa dialect was hard for us to understand. As the head soldier gave his orders, I noticed how handsome he was, even as he moved his head in a jerking manner. He couldn't have been more than 25 years old. 2 soldiers led 3 women into the circle. Amma was in the group. Right away, I pulled Tanky close so she wouldn't cry out. We watched as the women headed to the center of the square and were instructed to stand in a line. Amma kept her gaze toward the hills, while the other woman looked into the crowd as though silently requesting help. People murmured and shifted in agitation. Even Dixon began to growl beneath his shaggy bangs, so I nudged him twice with my knee to quiet him. "If the power of these so-called oracles are real," the merchant said, "if these superstitions have any basis, these women will surely pass a simple test." A soldier carried a large bowl of water into the middle of the crowd. He walked around the circle, showing the contents of the bowl. Inside, there were several stones within the water. All but one of the stones were ordinary. That one stone was bright red coral. "Red as the star on my head," the soldier said, pointing at his head with a smile. A few people smiled and laughed nervously in return. The soldiers went to the first woman in line and tied a blindfold around her eyes. I told myself there was nothing to fear. This test was not unlike the ones Amma faced during her initiation. She would surely find the coral among the pebbles. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrin. So I'm going to play a song for you called Trying from my first record, Repeating Myself. And it's kind of a song that was written about needing affirmation from others and then finding it in myself.
Tell me that you need me when I stumble, when I fall. I'm not trying to be clumsy, but my posture says it all. I could try to kick the habit, but I'm afraid I wouldn't recognize the only thing I got left from the wreckage and the fights. Move a little closer when I'm shaking off my nerves. I need to feel like I could hold you, like it's something I deserve. I'm not shy, I'm just broken. I'm not who I was before, warming up to being open. It's just not easy to ignore. It's not easy to ignore. Trying, I am trying to be okay.
take a 15-minute intermission. Thanks, everyone. relatively new song, unreleased, so that's kind of exciting. New to most of you, but not so new to me because I've been playing it for a couple years undercover. And it's called Between the Lines.
Do you think somebody up above is listening to your thoughts, giving you what you've got? I'd argue somebody that you love connects you with what you do, changing the course for you. They'll leave you broken, moving through the pines. Memories and thoughts unspoken, read between the lines. I'm changing the meaning of my days, watching the way you move. Reactions don't wait for you, overshaken, not used to making waves. If beauty is what you need, could you get that from me? Baby, it doesn't matter. I can't help but wonder why some force between us reads between the lines, between the lines, between the lines, between the lines. If I could, I'd be a lightning bug. If beauty is what you need, could you get that from me? Could you get that from me?
Thank you. Okay, moving along here. So, our next author, J.M. Miro, lives and writes in the Pacific Northwest. He also writes some days under the name Stephen Price. And just a little blurb here about what we're about to hear. So, in the gaslit streets of Victorian London, two children with mysterious powers are hunted by a figure of darkness, a man made of smoke, and must make their way to a secluded estate outside of Edinburgh in search of refuge. There, the world of the dead and the world of the living threaten to collide. Join me in welcoming J.M. Miro.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I usually begin by explaining a bit about what the book's about, but I don't need to do that because the introduction was so excellent. Some of you may know me under that other name, Stephen Price, but it's a little bit strange for me to be sitting here in front of a hometown crowd talking to you as if I'm somebody else. I made my wife and children promise not to come tonight because I was afraid my children would be either throwing popcorn at me or giggling through the whole thing. I'm going to read to you a little bit just from the opening of the novel. The book does follow these two, particularly these two children, these two boys, as they are escorted to Scotland to find what they think and hope is going to be safety in the late 19th century. The opening of the book introduces the readers to one of those children, a boy named Marlowe, who has the unusual ability or talent, as is described in the book, of glowing blue and being able to melt or mend flesh. But when the book picks up and introduces us to him, he's still a very, very young child. And he doesn't understand what it is that he is and what it is that he can do. The first time Eliza Gray laid eyes on the baby was at dusk in a slow-moving boxcar on a rain-swept stretch of the line 3 miles west of Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk, England. She was 16 years old, unlettered, unworldly, with eyes dark as the rain, hungry because she had not eaten since the night before last, coatless and hatless because she had fled in the dark without thinking where she could run to or what she might do next. Her throat still bore the marks of her employer's thumbs, her ribs the bruises from his boots. In her belly grew his baby, though she did not know it yet. She had left him for dead in his nightshirt, with a hairpin standing out of his eye. She'd been running ever since. When she came stumbling out of the trees and glimpsed across the darkening field the freight train's approach, she didn't think she could make it. But then, somehow, she was clambering the fence. Somehow, she was wading through the watery field, the freezing rain cutting sidelong into her. And then the greasy mud of the embankment was heavy and smearing her skirts as she fell and slid back and frantically clawed her way forward again. That was when she heard the dogs. She saw the riders appear out of the trees, figures of darkness, one after another, single file behind the fence line, the black dogs loose and barking and hurtling out ahead. She saw the men kick their horses into a gallop, and when she grabbed the handle of the boxcar and with the last of her strength swung herself up and in, she heard the report of a rifle, and something sparked stinging past her face, and she turned and saw the rider with the top hat, the dead man's terrifying father. He was standing in his stirrups and lifting the rifle again to take aim, and she rolled desperately in the straw away from the door and lay panting in the gloom as the train gathered speed. She must have slept. When she came to, her hair lay plastered along her neck. The floor of the boxcar rattled and thrumped under her. Rain was blowing in through the open siding. She could just make out the walls of lashed crates, stamped with Green King labels, and a wooden pallet overturned in the straw. There was something else, some kind of light left burning, just out of sight, faint, the stark blue of sheet lightning. But when she crawled over, she saw it was not a light at all. It was a baby, a little baby boy, glowing in the straw. All her life, she would remember that moment, how the baby's face flickered, a translucent blue, as if a lantern burned in its skin, the map of veins in its cheeks and arms and throat. She crawled closer. Next to the baby lay its black-haired mother, dead. I was told once, you should begin a book with something cheerful. Meanwhile, this is some time later, Marlowe, which is the name of that boy. Meanwhile, Marlowe, black-haired, coltish, grew. His skin stayed eerily white, a stark, unhealthy pallor, as if he'd never known sunlight. Yet he grew into a sweet toddler with a smile that could open a purse and eyes as blue as a Suffolk sky. But there was something else in him sometimes, a temper. And as he got older, Eliza would sometimes see him screw his face up into a fury and stamp his foot when he did not get his way, and she'd wonder what sort of a devil was in him. At such times, he'd scream and holler and grab whatever was nearest, a fig of coal, an inkwell, anything, and smash it to pieces. Brint tried to tell her that this was the normal way of a child, that 2-year-olds all went through it. There was nothing the matter with him. But Eliza was not so sure. For there was that one night in St. George's Street when he wanted something. What was it? A stick of licorice in a shop front window? And Eliza, tired maybe, or just distracted, had told him no, firmly, and dragged him by the hand away through the crowds. There was a wide cobblestone stair leading down to Bolt Alley, and she dragged him to it. I want it, he was crying. He'd scowled at her with such darkness and poison then, and she'd felt a heat bloom in her palm and fingers where she gripped his, and she'd stopped in the middle of the cobbled stair in the faint yellow of a gas lamp above and seen that same blue shine coming out of him, and a most excruciating pain came over her hand. Marla was glaring at her in anger, fuming, watching her face twist in agony, and she'd screamed and pushed him away, and there in the shadows was a figure in a cloak at the bottom of the cobblestone stair, and it turned and stared up at them, as still and unmoving as a pillar of darkness. But it had no face, only smoke, and she'd shuddered to see it. But then Marlowe's anger was gone, the blue shine was gone. He was peering up at her where he had fallen in the muck, peering up in confusion, and fear contorted his little pale face, and he started to cry. She cradled her hand against her chest and wrapped it in her shawl and drew the child close with her good arm, crooning softly, feeling both ashamed and afraid. And she looked around, but the thing on the stairs below was gone. Then Marla was 6, and they had lost the theater in Wapping to the rents, and all were living in a miserable room off Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields. But it seemed to her that maybe Brint had been wrong. Maybe it was possible to outrun your mistakes after all. It had been 2 years since the advertisements and the broadsheets had stopped appearing. From Spitalfields, Eliza trudged all the way down to the Thames to Mudlark in the thick, deep, gluey muck of the river at low tide. Brint being too heavy to manage it, Marlowe still far too young. But he would run alongside the coal wagons in the foggy streets, picking up the little rocks of coal from the cobblestones, sliding under the legs of the horses and dodging the iron-shod wheels, while Brint stood behind the bollards watching him with worried eyes. Eliza liked very little about Spitalfields. It was dark and vicious. But she did like the way Marlowe survived it, the toughness in him, the way he learned watchfulness, his large eyes dark with knowing. And sometimes at night he still climbed onto the bug-riddled mattress beside her, and she listened to his heart beating very fast, and it was like it had been before, when he was a baby, uncomplicated and sweet and good. But not always. In the spring of that year, she had come upon him crouched in a trash-strewn alley off Thrall Street, holding his left wrist in his right hand, and that shine started out from his hands and his throat and his face, just as had happened all those years ago. The glow was blue and bleeding through the fog. When he took his hand away, his skin, for just a moment, was bubbling and oozing. Then it smoothed itself back to normal. Eliza cried out, despite herself. She couldn't help it. And Marlowe turned guiltily and pulled his sleeve down, and like that, the shine was gone. "Mama," he said. They were alone in that alley, but she could hear the silk wagons creaking not 10 paces from them in the fog-thick street beyond, and the roar and shouting of men at their selling carts. "Oh, my heart," she murmured. She kneeled beside him, uncertain what more to say. She did not think he would remember that day when he'd burned her hand. Whether he knew what he did or not, she could not be sure, but she knew it was not a good thing in this world to be different. She tried to explain this to him. She said every person has two destinies granted them by God, and that it is a person's task in this life to choose the one or the other. She looked into his little face and saw his cheeks white in the cold and his black hair long over his ears, and she felt an overwhelming sadness. "You always have a choice, Marlowe," she said. "Do you understand me?" He nodded, but she did not think he understood at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, so our next author, Danny Ramadan, is a Syrian-Canadian author and advocate for LGBTQ refugees. His debut novel, The Clothesline Swing, was shortlisted for the Lambda Literary Award and longlisted for Canada Reads. He has an MFA in creative writing from UBC and lives with his husband in Vancouver, BC. Please welcome Danny Ramadan.
I have no idea who that person is who just got introduced. I was just walking outside and they're like, "Oh yeah, you look brown enough, come in. Can you read?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So they paid me $25 actually on my way out. So I'm holding that on, please, thank you. Hi folks, thank you so much for hosting me. I always appreciate my relationship with the Victoria Festival of Authors. I have been working with you folks for a couple of years and this is my first time visiting you. So it's always a pleasure working with you. Also, my husband originally lived in Sydney, he was born and raised in Sydney, which is around the corner. And I think he is slowly but surely migrating me towards here. So when we met, we lived in downtown Vancouver, and now we moved to Burnaby, and now we're moving to White Rock, and I feel like he's trying his very best to cross that sea. I'm reading to you today from the Foghorn Echoes, which is my second novel, and it follows the stories of Hussam and Wasim. Hussam and Wasim, the novel starts, are teenage boys who are best friends growing up in Damascus, Syria. Hussam is very close to his father, and we are about to see what happens between those two boys. It's, just to add some more, it's Damascus 2003. The city, as I experienced growing up there, was buzzing with the stories of the American invasion of Iraq, neighboring country Iraq. "Do you think we can see the war from here?" Hussam said. He stood with Wasim at the edge of the rooftop, looking up at the sky where the pigeons flew. "Are you stupid?" Wasim said. "It's too far away." Hussam argued that explosions from airstrikes, or the columns of smokes at least, might be big enough to be seen from across the border. Wasim gazed off the horizon. "Maybe if we climbed on the bird cages, then to the top of the elevator shaft," he suggested. They examined the pigeons' cages, cornered between the edge of the rooftop and the walls of the elevator engine. The shaft rested like a small cube placed neatly on the rooftop. They agreed that in order to climb the wall, they would need to balance on the stone corner of the perimeter wall, then rely on a metal rod on the side of the engine room to avoid the deadly slip to the ground 7 floors down. It would be an easy pull to end up on that small roof and have a better view of the city and possibly the surrounding countries. "Let's do it," Wasim said, and moments later he pulled Hussam up onto the roof of the small shaft. The boys stood together, looking out over the city. How are we going to get down? Hussam asked. A strong gust shuddered against him and wheezed through his clothes. It felt strong enough to carry them off into the sky like paper kites. He reached out and held Wasim's hand tightly. I want to go down, he whined. Don't be a chicken, Wasim said. He squeezed Hussam's hand and told him not to look down. They scanned the horizon for columns of smoke, falling helicopters, or red and blue rockets. They soon gave up and sat on the edge of the engine room roof, their feet dangling over the side. The city opened its embrace to them. The heart of Damascus was marked by the Umayyad Mosque, decorated with intricate mosaics that glimmered under the sun. The mosque was crowded by low risers and tiny old homes that pushed onto one another across narrow alleyways, barely wide enough for bikes and horse carriages. Those were surrounded by taller buildings built by the Ottomans and the French back in their days of occupation. These were now also circled by Soviet-inspired cubes of metal and cement, and finally, the tallest of buildings at the edges of the city. Damascus was a rebel city that ricocheted history back at its people, and every era was marked on its map. Hussam looked down at his hand intertwined with Wasim. He gazed into his friend's eye. Their blue glimmered like quiet lakes. Wasim's nose gloriously anchored his face like the statues Hussam had seen in the National Museum of Historical Arts. Wasim released his hand and now stretched his arm around Hussam's shoulder. His palm hung loosely, and his fingers swiftly brushed Hussam's nipple. It was a move that watched in Hollywood romantic comedies. The budding lovers on the screen were usually in a movie theater. The young man would pretend to yawn, then drop his arm around the woman's shoulder. Just like in the movies, Hussam dropped his head on Wasim's shoulder and cozied up to him. He felt Wasim squeeze him closer, his fingers hot on his skin. Wasim felt a shiver down his spine and looked down at Hussam. They locked eyes for a moment and words died on their tongues. Hussam took this as a sign. He leaned forward and kissed his friend on the lips. Wasim's feet kicked the air as if electricity jolts rushed through their veins. He pushed Hussam back and sounded as if he was gasping for air. They exchanged fearful looks, unable to produce a sound. Hussam blushed and avoided Wasim's eyes. Wasim took another deep breath, as if preparing to dive underwater, and then he leaned back in. His lips met Hussam's softly, as though he was on his knees, drinking from a desert's oasis. They kissed for a long time. The sun must have dusked and dawned 1,000 times. The moon, a glittering curve in the night sky, smiled at them. Wasim clutched at Hussam's hair, then released it. He slid his hands up and down his back before resting them on his waist. Hussam's feet shook. His arms rested by his side, as if in surrender to Wasim's new intensity. Then came the echo of their names. Hussam's father stood by the bird cages, looking up. His eyes were wide, and his face was a shade of red about to explode. He reached up and tried to grab them by the legs, but Hussam and Wasim quickly pulled their feet up. I will kill you both today, he shouted. He pointed at the ground and demanded they come down. Baba, it's not what... Come down, you pieces of shit. I'll break your skulls in half. Hussam gasped when his father started climbing towards them, cursing. Wasim slid backwards behind him, and Hussam dragged his palms on the rough gravel of the rooftop, piercing his skin. Hussam's father climbed the engine's room and was almost on top of it when his foot slipped. He landed standing on top of the bird cages, which ached under his weight. Cursing under his breath, he attempted to climb once more and raised himself with both arms to the little exposed roof. He was close enough now that his son could smell the iron on his fingers and see the veins pulsing on his forehead. He could see his cracked tooth and the silver watch on his hairy wrist, a Father's Day gift. Both Hussam and Wasim would be able to recall this moment vividly for years to come. They would remember every twitch of a muscle in their bodies and every whip of a fire in their brains. They would forever remember whose foot kicked Hussam's father, the sound of the sole of Wasim's shoe made against the man's face. It wasn't a strong kick, it wouldn't have harmed him, but it caused him to lose his grip. Hussam, who moments before had tried to pull away from his father's hand, reached out to him, now as he slipped from the metal rod he clung on. But Hussam barely managed to touch the tips of his fingers before his father lost his balance. With a gasp, he fell to the pigeons' cages, smashing their roofs and releasing the frightened birds. His body rolled and landed on the perimeter's wall, surrounded by the flapping wings of shivering birds. And for a second, it rested there, as if deciding which side it would fall to. Then, as if in small motion, he slipped off the side of the building. Baba! They heard the body hit the ground with a muffled thud. Hussam dangled from the engine's room. Don't jump, Wasim shouted, but Hussam released his grip on the edge and fell into the broken birdcage. A nail, as long as a finger, poked through the sole of his shoe into the arch of his foot, but Hussam didn't feel it. He ran down the stairs, screaming his father's name, a trail of blood behind him. Hussam! Hussam ignored his friend. He leaped down the stairs in 3s and 4s. His panting bounced off the walls and filled the staircase. What have I done? What have I done? What have I done? He repeated in whisper with every jump he took until he reached the ground floor and sprinted to the building's glass gate. The elevator behind him opened and Wasim, covered in sweat, appeared between the sliding doors. Hussam, wait! He rushed after Hussam, and the two ran into the huddle of men who had gathered, whispering the many names of Allah. Hussam weaseled his way through, pushing men out of the way and shouting unrecognizable words. Don't look at my child. A man tried to shield Hussam's eyes with his palm. Hussam slapped the hand away and screamed for his father. The names of Hussam and his father were murmured around the boy, acknowledged by neighbors who had borrowed a cup of sugar from them or shopkeepers who had sold them a carton of eggs. His body was splayed on the ground, a clean white bone stabbing out below the knee. One arm twisted unnaturally behind him, and his face was split with a stream of blood. Child, he's gone, a man behind him said. Hussam was down on his knees now, hands covered in blood, attempting to put his father back together, holding his father's red beard between his palms, pushing it back against his face. Wasim placed his hand on Hussam's shoulder. For a moment, Hussam seemed not to notice, his eyes fixed on the broken glass of the silver watch. Then he looked up and locked eyes with Wasim. Don't touch me, he whispered, but Wasim kept his grip tight. Hussam, Wasim whispered back. I said, don't touch me. The men reciting the Quran around the body raised their voices, and an ambulance siren wailed in the distance. Hussam, we have to be on the same page. Wasim pulled him up. This was an accident. Fuck you, Hussam shouted, but Wasim was quick to pull him in for an embrace. The men pushed them out of the way, opening the circle for the paramedics. Hussam tried to entangle himself, but Wasim only tightened his hold. No one can know what happened, Hussam, he said. No one can know what we were doing before. Hussam's shoulder tensed and his back stiffened. I'll take care of you. I'll take care of this, Wasim whispered. Surrounding windows opened, and the heads of men appeared one after another, followed by the heads of women tightening their hijabs around their faces. The heads of Wasim's parents and Hussam's mother popped out of Wasim's penthouse. The women howled, and Wasim's father shouted in terror. Hussam, still in Wasim's embrace, looked up, his father's blood still on his jeans and socks. All he could see were the birds flying away with no one to whistle them back. That was a lot. I wasn't actually planning to read more than this, but I feel like if I left you with this, you're going to have nightmares. So I'm going to read something from the end of the book, which is blasphemy in the world of writers. This is very short, 2 or 3 minutes, I promise. And this is a small, self-contained story. The book continues after that first chapter ends, telling you from a first-person perspective the stories of Hussam and Wasim. Hussam, 10 years later, is an immigrant in Canada. He lives in Vancouver, and he dulls his trauma with sex, drugs, and alcohol, while Wasim is homeless in Damascus after a failed attempt to cross the sea to Europe. This is from his journey out of Syria. The taxi driver asked if I was escaping military service, and I told him that I was an only child. You're the lucky one, he said. You're the only one who won't be called up in these times. You never know, I said from the back seat. You never know, he repeated. There were 3 of us in the car, myself, the driver, and his friend in the front. They told me the trip wouldn't be long, and especially since I was legally leaving Syria with my passport, there wouldn't be any trouble at the border. We passed the windy streets of Aleppo quickly, leaving behind the heavy shelling noise in eastern neighborhoods. With every explosion, I jumped in the back seat, while both the driver and his friend nonchalantly continued their conversation. On our way out of the city, we were saluted by its dimly lit citadel. The fortress, made of stones too large for 12 men to carry, had survived 2,000 years and hundreds of wars. It looked abandoned, save for a large Syrian flag and a tower-tall picture of Bashar al-Assad. Hours later, we neared the Turkish border. We parked in the long line of cars leaving the country, some empty except for a passenger or 2, others packed to the roof with luggage. The line stretched for miles ahead of us, and the driver and his friend left the car to smoke. I heard a ringtone coming from the inside of the car. I lowered the window and told the driver that his phone was ringing. He flashed his phone to me, and before I could say more, the ringing stopped. By the time we reached the border check, the sun had already risen, and dryness filled my mouth. The driver's friend had fallen asleep, while the driver smoked yet another cigarette, puffing the smoke through his opened window. He elbowed his friend awake, and they handed their document to the officer to leave through. Where's Malik? The driver asked. I thought this was his shift. Malik is sick today, the officer responded. He looked at me through the window, and I handed him my passport. He looked at it, and then at my face. He lifted the passport up to examine it in the direct sunlight. Then he bent it. I thought he might bite it next to ensure its authenticity, but he finally handed it back. The driver was about to start the engine again, but the officer asked him to open the trunk. Malik never asked us to open the trunk. His voice was shaky. Well, I'm not Malik. Now open the trunk. The driver exchanged a look with his friend before he pulled the lever by his side, and the trunk unlocked. What's going on? I whispered to them. The driver hushed me while following the officer with his eyes. We are fucked. His friend nodded in agreement. It finally dawned on me that someone was hiding in the trunk. That is where the ringtone came from. The officer pulled the trunk open. Seconds passed. My finger trembled, and I felt a tightness in my stomach. You brought this on me, I said to the driver and his friend, and they shushed me in unison. A few moments later, and the officer closed the trunk, tapped on it twice, and ordered us to drive away. The driver, not believing his ears, hit the road fast, leaving a cloud of dust behind. I wanted to look back, but he shouted at me to keep my face forward. We drove for 10 minutes in silence until the border disappeared behind us. And then he parked on the side of the road, and the three of us jumped out of the car. Together, we opened the trunk. Inside was the smuggled man. He was drunk. The driver explained to me that the man was due to join military service to fight on the front lines. Not wanting to be part of the war and knowing well that his name was on the no-travel list, he had no option but to be smuggled. The man broke into fits of laughter and stank of whiskey. He told us that using the flashlight on his phone, he had found a box containing 4 bottles of whiskey stashed back there. I had nothing to do but drink up. The man shielded his eyes from the harsh sun. He had guzzled the alcohol on an empty stomach and had passed out until the officer opened the trunk. We both froze, he told us. Without thinking, he had handed a full bottle of whiskey to the officer. The officer looked at the bottle, back at the man, then snatched the bottle and closed the trunk. The funny part is, the man said slowly, I can't tell if I gave him the bottle filled with alcohol or the one I drank and then filled with my own piss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. That was very fun. I'm going to close us off here with a song called Wear Sunscreen. Thanks so much to the Victoria Festival of Authors. This has been a very fun night. And thanks to all of you for coming out as well.
I've been sleeping in too late. Let my hair grow past my waist. Maybe it's the season. I'll justify my reason. I see you swimming in your head through catalogs of what feels best. You'll pull apart the pages eventually. Maybe it gets better. If that's true, it would be my pleasure. I forgot
so much. Thank you, Jen Severtson. Thank you to our authors, J.M. Miro, Danny Ramadan, Shalene McKnight, and Sering Yazum Lama. If you're interested in purchasing any of the books, you can visit Ali at the Monroe's book table, and the authors will hang around for a little bit for signing. There are still a festival events to enjoy this year, so please refer to your program, and you can visit the website as well, victoriafestivalofauthors.ca, which features interviews with all the authors that we're participating in VFA 2022, and it also offers you a place to sign up for the newsletter. You may also wish to support the festival in other ways, and you can give us a like and a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and encourage your friends to attend one of our upcoming events. You can also make a tax-deductible donation to the Victoria Festival of Authors through the website or VFA's page at Canada Helps. And your donations really do help us keep VFA an engaging, accessible, and sustainable festival. Thanks, good night, and I hope we'll see you again.